small population to a very large population, bilinguals. So Dave Kenneth Cayado is going to speak today about language co-activation influences the development of new implicit linguistic knowledge in bilinguals. So go ahead and start whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Dave Cayado. I'm a PhD student right now at the Queen Mary University of London. And I'll be presenting my research that investigates whether language co-activation in bilinguals influences the development of new implicit linguistic knowledge. So this is the research that I did for my MPhil at the University of Hong Kong, and it's under the supervision of Dr. Ricky Chan. Yeah. So in bilingual lexical processing literature, we have ample evidence showing that both of our L1 and L2 remain simultaneously active during comprehension and production, even in contexts when only one of the two languages is relevant. So this kind of suggests that bilinguals cannot simply switch off their non-current language or the language that is not relevant in a particular context. However, yeah. And a major source of evidence for that came from eye tracking literature using visual world paradigm. For example, in Mishra and Singh, they looked at Hindi-English bilinguals and investigated whether processing in the current language, in this case English, would be influenced by the non-current language Hindi. So in each trial, they presented 4 photos like this. So we have a picture of a gun, a rope, a bed, and a monkey. And upon hearing the English instruction, click on the monkey, Hindi-English bilinguals tend to also look at the picture of a gun before finally settling on monkey. And this is because the Hindi translation of the target word and the competitor share the same first syllable ban. So bandar for monkey and banduk for gun. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. Yeah. So what that suggests is that even though the entire task is in English, their Hindi is also influencing processing in the current language. And the same phenomenon had been observed in different bilingual populations like Russian English bilinguals, German English bilinguals, Dutch English bilinguals, and Chinese English bilinguals using different psycholinguistic measures like eye movements, reaction time, and ERP-EEG. However, majority of these studies mainly focused on trial by trial real-time processing in the current language based on their existing linguistic knowledge. So in this research, I tried to investigate whether the same constant activation of the non-current language would also influence the development of new implicit linguistic knowledge. So that brings us to the idea of implicit learning, which is a type of learning mechanism that does not require conscious awareness of what is being learned, or so they say, and it produces a type of knowledge that is inaccessible to awareness, or it cannot be easily verbalized. So this type of knowledge is said to be implicit, unconscious, tacit, and non-declarative. And in implicit learning literature, the main questions that are being investigated is that what linguistic features are amenable to implicit learning in a novel language, and potentially what are the constraints that affect the amenability of this implicit learning mechanism in a novel language. And so far, we have a wide range of evidence showing that these linguistic features are amenable to implicit learning, or at least incidental learning, and the knowledge they develop may be implicit. However, they also found that implicit learning is not totally unconstrained. So it's subject to different biases and cross-linguistics influences. And one great example of that is from Liang and Williams 2014, who looked at the mappings between novel articles and long-flat distinctions. And the reason why they chose long-flat distinction is because of how it is linguistically encoded in written Chinese and in English. In written Chinese, so flat objects like photos and blankets would be marked by this character, whereas long, thin objects like ties and straws are marked by this character, whereas no such marking exists in English. And they use semi-artificial language for this experiment. They use Jiro Ulne as artificial or novel articles, and they informed participants that Ji and Ro are only for near objects, and Ul and Ne are only for far objects. What they did not tell the participants is that Ji and Ul only went with long objects, whereas Ro and Ne only went with flat objects. And in each trial, they presented participants first with a fixation cross, followed by the stimulus G straw. And then participants had to decide whether it is long or flat. And then it would disappear, be replaced by the near and far prompt N and F. And then they had to decide whether G straw meant near or far. So basically, the purpose of the near far judgment is to just kind of hide the real point of interest in the study and also make the participants focus on the novel articles. And interestingly, they found that in this particular experiment, only the Chinese group learned the hidden regularities or the mappings between novel articles and long flat distinction, while the English group did not learn it in this particular, given the same amount of time and giving the same number of stimuli. Chinese speakers learned it, whereas the native English speakers did not. So what this tells us is that even though implicit learning is said to be domain general, it's subject to different cross-linguistics influences. So this particular study attributed their findings to the explicit marking or encoding of long flat distinction in Chinese. And the same findings were found as well in learning of tonal phonotactics. So they learned that the speakers of tonal languages learned a novel language that's tonal, but those like native English speakers did not, given the same amount of exposure. What we do not know yet is the cognitive basis of this cross-linguistics influence in implicit learning. What's driving this cross-linguistics influence? So in this research, we predict that it's the constant activation of bilinguals on current language that's maybe driving this cross-linguistics influence in implicit learning. So overall, these are the questions that I explored in this study that we explored. So first, I asked whether the mappings between novel articles and firewater semantic categories can be learned implicitly, which is a type of form meaning connections that have not been given attention yet in semantic implicit learning literature. Second, I asked if the cognitive basis of cross-linguistic influence in implicit what is the cognitive basis of cross-linguistic influence in implicit learning? And lastly, I explore whether the constant activation of bilinguals on current language can also influence the development of new implicit linguistic knowledge. Yeah, so I adopted the same novel articles and methods as Liang and Williams, but this time chose or I chose the fire and water semantic categories as a learning target for the same reason of how it is linguistically encoded in written Chinese. Particularly in Chinese, water-related characters or water-related characters have to be marked by either one of these semantic radicals, and fire-related characters have to be marked by either one of these semantic radicals. And I told my participants that J and Rho are for near objects, Ul and Ne are for far objects. What they did not know is that G Ul only went with water-related words, whereas Rho and Ne only went with fire-related words. Yeah, so I formed two groups here, for one for Cantonese English bilinguals and one for the native English group with no knowledge of Chinese at all. Yeah, so this is what the trial looks like. First, there is a fixation cross for 500 milliseconds to be replaced by the stimulus G rain, and then participants have to decide whether it is fire or water related as quickly and as accurately as they can. And the near far prompt, followed by the near far prompt. So near or far, is G rain near or far? Crucially, we employed control and violation trials in the experiment. So control trials are those that followed the hidden rules. For example, G drizzle and Ul shower are control trials because they followed the hidden rules. G and Ul are for water-related words, whereas those violation trials are those that did not follow the hidden rules, like raw ocean. Raw should be for fire, but in this case, it was used with water-related word. And the assumption is that if participants had learned the hidden regularity, then they should significantly slow down when presented with violation trials, because it's like their mind telling them, oh, there's something wrong with it. So it will take them longer time to kind of respond to it. And yeah, so there were 4 blocks in total. Blocks 1 and 2 served as the training phase with 84 trials each, and blocks 3 and 4 served as the testing phase with control and violation trials. And after these 4 blocks, we conducted a retrospective verbal report. We probed participants' knowledge that they developed during the experiment. So we asked them if they noticed any patterns in the experiment regarding the use of the novel articles, and if they say that they didn't, then we encourage them to make as many guesses as possible to encourage them to kind of verbalize any knowledge that they may not be confident about. Yes, so our prediction is that if the activation of the non-current L1 influences implicit language learning, then it should only be the bilingual group that would show implicit learning effects of the target form meaning connections because of the explicit marking of fire and water semantic categories in written Chinese. And no such effect should be found for the native English group. So that's not what we found. Long story short, yeah. So for in this graph, I have the log transform reaction time data. In the y-axis, there is the log transform RT, and then in the x-axis we have the trial, so control trial, and for CT violation trial for VT. So participants in both groups significantly slowed down in violation trials as compared to the control trials. And we also analyzed the accuracy data as a secondary measure of implicit learning, and we found that they became less accurate in violation trials compared to the control trial. So what this tells us is that both Cantonese English bilinguals and native English speakers learn the associations between novel articles and firewater semantic categories. And since we only analyzed data from participants who were not able to verbalize the hidden rules, this suggests that the knowledge they developed may be implicit. So in this particular experiment, it extends the range of semantic-based regularities that are amenable to implicit learning. But I think the elephant in the room here is that we did not get any conclusive results for our initial prediction. So we think that it's because the entire experiment was conducted in English. Unlike in the experiment of Liang and Williams, they did the experiment in Chinese for the Chinese group and the experiment in English for the English group, which in our case, everyone did the experiment in English, which could have given the native English group an advantage and put the bilingual group at a disadvantage since they did the experiment and they're less dominant, potentially less proficient language. But despite that, they still learned, they still showed implicit learning effects of the target form meaning connections. So for our experiment too, we further probe whether that implicit learning effects exhibited by the bilingual group in experiment 1 were due to the constant activation of their non-current L1 Cantonese. Wait, what's happening? Can you still see my screen? Yeah, okay. So we formed 3 bilingual groups in this experiment, and they watched 3 different 30-minute videos before the same experiment, the same retrospective verbal report, the same stimuli. And the purpose of that video is to kind of control the activation level of bilinguals' languages. So this is a method adapted from Elson-Getlar of 2005 or 2004. Yeah. So the purpose of this is to control the activation level of languages. Specifically, we expect for the English video group, we expect their Cantonese to be suppressed and their English to be more activated. In the Cantonese video group, we expect their Cantonese to be enhanced. And the silent video group, there is no suppression at all. So it served as a control group. And then after this 30-minute video, they did the same experimental task. And the assumption is that if the learning effects, implicit learning effects we observed in experiment 1 were influenced by the activation of their non-current L1 Cantonese, then we should not observe that implicit learning effect when the Cantonese was suppressed. So in the English video group, whereas the implicit learning effect should be sustained for the control group and potentially enhanced for the Cantonese video group. And so this is the log transformed RT that we for this experiment. Again, in the y-axis, we have the logged and RT, and then the trial below, and then the 3 groups: Cantonese video, English video, and silent video groups. And we found here that only the Cantonese video group and the silent video group showed implicit learning effects of the same target form meaning connections. But this time, the English video group did not show any. The implicit learning effects for the English video group seems to have disappeared. We did not find any significant effect for accuracy this time. Yeah. So in summary, based on the logged and RT data, the implicit learning effects observed in the bilingual group in experiment 1 seems to have disappeared when Cantonese activation was suppressed. But yeah. And the implicit learning effects were sustained when Cantonese remains highly activated in Cantonese video group, or if it's not suppressed at all in the silent video group. So the combined findings for both experiments indicate that the Cantonese English bilinguals non-current L1 influence implicit learning of the target form meaning connections, but such cross-linguistic influence seems to be dependent on the activation level of their non-current Cantonese. So in conclusion, we found that the mappings between novel articles and firewater semantic categories can be learned implicitly, which is a new type of form meaning connections that we found to be amenable for semantic implicit learning. Second, we have evidence showing that the covert activation of bilinguals non-current language may also influence the development of new implicit linguistic knowledge. Yeah, and lastly, the activation level of bilinguals non-current language may be the cognitive basis of the previously attested cross-linguistic influence in implicit learning, which is important if we were to have a full understanding of how we can strategically control the occurrence of this cross-linguistic influence in language learning in general. So for future work, I think one problem that we had with this experiment is that I'm thinking that the fire and water semantic categories may not be unique enough or as unique as the long flat distinction. So I'm thinking that maybe I'm planning, I'm not sure if I can do it, that to replicate the experiment using the same long flat distinction, but this time present it all in English, the same thing that I did here, to kind of further strengthen the findings that that the activation of this non-current language can also influence implicit language learning. And yeah, thank you so much. I'd like to acknowledge my supervisors, Dr. Ricky Chan and Professor Janil Young from Hong Kong University, and our RA, Bruce Wang and Ada Lee, who helped me came up with the Chinese stimuli because I don't speak Chinese. Thank you so much.